Our second speaker is Dr. Tim Wilson. He has a wealth of experience in a wide range of areas. He's currently partner at PricewaterhouseCoopers Healthcare. He's been involved in the Department of Health Strategy Unit, and he's also practiced as a GP. And Tim's talk today has got the intriguing title, Policy and Evidence, What Matters is What Works. So I'm keen to hear what he has to say about that.
And again, you can hear me, that's all right. And if you can't hear me, we can turn it down, or whatever, or if you can hear me, whichever. Anyway, actually, I sort of changed the title slightly, but it is, in effect, much the same. And the reason Dan and I thought we'd just run through is actually there is quite a complementarity between our two talks. And as Dan said, if you like, he's now outlined some very interesting specific interventions, albeit very complex interventions, whether it's exercise referral scheme, opening times of GPs and effect on stroke. And I'm sort of perhaps moving us up to a much bigger, more macro level. How does health policy work? And this is really based on a lot of experience and a lot of thinking I've done over the last few years. I was fortunate enough to be a Harkness Fellow, and the subject of my Harkness Fellowship was to go and look at collaboratives, or the Breakthrough series. And collaboratives, for those of you who don't know, were a very fashionable sort of form of quality improvement around the early 2000s. And everybody wanted to know, do collaboratives work or don't they? Well, my answer to that question, I can tell you categorically, is somewhat. And this is probably going to be the problem with all these things, is the answer to all these questions is somewhat. So I'm going to ask you three questions. I'm going to pounce on three of you in a minute, because I'm going to ask you to be the Secretary of State for Health in England. I'm then going to talk a bit about causality and effect, picking up a lot of what Dan was saying. Then refer to sort of something about the political and media context that policy decisions get made. And when I was working at the Department of Health in the Strategy Unit, this was the aha moment for me, the difficulty around that. And then the final bit, I suddenly realised actually this also reaches into work I've done in the past around complexity and judgment. So I'm going to just pounce on you. So you're number one, you're going to answer the first question, okay? You're number two, and you're number three, because you're looking away. All right, so just putting you on the spot now, GP commissioning, big policy, do you do it or do you not? Yes, okay. Referral management, or just referral management schemes, do you do them or not?
Somewhat.
So, no. You've got to do it. You're the Secretary of State. You can't somewhat do something because you're going to do them, okay? And life-saving cancer drugs to children, do you do them or not?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. So actually, yes to all of those. You're a very positive bunch, I'm glad to say. So you can't answer somewhat, because that's the key to all this. This very complex diagram, it comes from a piece of work we're presently doing around health inequalities, where we're helping local authorities and PCTs try to think through the linkages between the things they do and what the final impact would be. So they're trying to reduce overall at the top there the inequality gradient in childhood obesity. That's what they're trying to achieve. And what they're doing is, in a certain context within the organisation, they're putting in all these different sort of bits and pieces. This is a fairly incomplete set of things, but it just gives you a flavour of the complexity of the interrelationships. So an education programme could affect motivation, which might change local pride, which might have reduced crime rates, which may mean more children are willing to walk to school, increased level of activity. Do you see what I mean? So these things, doing something here will have an effect there, which have an effect there, which might have an impact there, and so on and so forth. And that's what I want you to bear in mind. Interventions aren't simple. There's not a direct linear effect. There was a fantastic paper, or a couple of papers actually, by Richard Lilford and colleagues, who started to sort of say, well, okay, how can we think around this? So this paper, I think, well, it's got the date here, so it came out earlier on this year. Very good paper, started to think about what is it that works. And so they were saying, look, if you put in some sort of intervention, it could be down there, X, and in this case that could be exercise referral scheme, or it could be getting people to a stroke clinic or getting people stroke care quickly. There's a whole range of other things that need to go on, the structure of the service, the policy interventions, intervening variables, and so on and so forth. I think this is a very brave attempt to start to understand the context in which all these things happen. I have to say, as you will gather from my previous diagram, I think it's probably somewhat oversimplified, but hey, it's a good start. Now, whenever you're putting a policy in place, you're trying to get, a movement, aren't you, in the curve? So we'd normally have a sort of, usual distribution curve like that, for whatever. So for our colleague here, who's somewhat going to do referral management centres, and you might want to increase referrals or decrease referrals, whatever it might be. You want to see a move, don't you, in the shift in the curve? So it has an effect overall. I think that's probably right. The problem is it doesn't work like that. The net cause of my causality diagram, or Richard Lilford's work, is there's all these feedback loops. So you don't exactly go from here to here. There's all these other intervening factors in place. What are the incentive structures? What are the other policy things? What are the things that, what effect does the tariff, the national tariff or payment mechanisms have? What does the actual organisational structure have? What does professional development do to all this? You can start to imagine all the little factors that go into here that are they're going to influence this outcome. And what this made me realise, and this is why at the end I come back to complexity theory, is there is a thinking around complexity theory that when you take four distinct bodies, planets, let's say, it gets to the point where it's impossible to actually work out gravitational effect because the feedback loops are so complex. And the problem, what I'm sort of starting to say here, is because you've got this sort of feedback loop that's getting so complex, and minor adjustments might have huge effects over here, you're starting to think about complexity theory. This gets really difficult. So world-class commissioning, we've got a mixed audience here. Some people in the audience will know what world-class commissioning and some won't. World-class commissioning was a big programme run by the Department of Health to improve the quality of commissioning or purchasing of healthcare in England, and it was basically an assurance programme where people went out to visit PCTs and rated them. As a bit of naughtiness, we looked at the relationship as a firm between their score on a particular competency, number 11, and that competency is about value for money, and the degree to which they're delivering value for money. And this is the savings by population per 100,000. Now this comes from nationally available databases about what savings could be achieved. When I say savings, it's things like avoidable admissions or moving to cheaper statins or whatever it might be. A range of different things go into this pot here. And I think you can pretty much agree there's very little correlation between this, what you might say, savings here and their score. So higher scores did not necessarily translate to more effective or more efficient. And we've got other graphs to show you a similar sort of thing. So let's move on. Let's think about GP commissioning. So answer your question, do GP commissioning, yes or no? And our Secretary of State said yes. And you're absolutely right. It is yes. Possibly. Because it all depends what you're trying to achieve politically. So Muir's point about values having a greater driver is absolutely spot on. When political parties come in, they come in with a set of ideologies and beliefs, and that's what drives them. So when I was at the department, this is actually one of the things we did around what we call practice level incentives. And this goes way back 7 years ago. So you might say this is the start of the thinking around GP commissioning. And we did look at all the evidence base and the research out there both, and try to extrapolate international stuff and said what would happen in the UK context and stuff. And we tried to boil it all down for the policymakers. And this is what we realised. There's a number of things. One is you could look at the range of different types of budget you give to clinicians. This is what we're heading to, full real practice level, well actually it's consortia level budgets. I suppose maybe it's that one actually. Real practice level, so you're moving right up there, but it's real budgets. But with that movement, moving up this scale, all these things happen. Now look, some of these are interesting. We said alienating the profession is more likely to happen the more real budgets are. because we know the history of GP fund holding, incredibly well researched. It's probably one of the most extensively pieces of research of policy ever. And we know that the profession was incredibly divided, so it was alienating. On the other hand, many of the profession was highly motivated. So you get some of these things that happen which seem apparently contradictory. The more you go up here, the more likely you are to get a motivated profession who are willing to engage, but actually you're probably going to alienate a whole load of them at the same time. Incentives and drivers for change go up here, but you might get more likely to get distortions and gaming. The higher up you go here, the harder you make those budgets. So provided our Secretary of State here is willing to accept distortions and gaming, but actually wants to increase the incentives and drivers for change, she's quite right. It all depends what you want to do. So a piece of policy will have mixed effects. In answer to our questions, so our favourite newspaper, the Daily Mail, I don't know, again, for folks not from the UK, they perhaps won't know the full glories of this newspaper, also known as the Daily Whale. Here it is, here's the headline. And I thought for this talk I had a quick look, didn't have to look very far. There's something in the paper today about children with bone cancer denied life-saving drug by NICE. NICE is the Daily Mail just thinks NICE is the devil incarnate. You look at the NICE appraisal. What does it say here? It basically, the drug doesn't make much difference whatsoever. It's phenomenally expensive and really makes zero difference. The confidence intervals look pretty much all go across one. Life-saving drug doesn't work. So, and yet, this I can promise you is what Mr. Healy, who's the Labour Party health lead in the department, is saying to Mr. Lansley, you're denying my patients life-saving drugs. Okay? That's the context. Referral management centres. So somewhat, I think we finally got you to say that yes, you go for them, go for referral management centres. This is interesting. This is the press release up here from the King's Fund. So if you go to the King's Fund website, look at press release on their paper on really good report on referral management centres, I hasten to add. That's failed to deliver, so I'm afraid you got it wrong. Unless you actually read the report where it says they do work, but somewhat. So your answer was right. Somewhat was a pretty good answer. And this is the context. If you're the Secretary of State and making a decision, do I roll out referrals management centres? The answer is, yeah, but only under circumstances. There's a nuance here, there's a subtlety here. Not all referral management centres work. Just building a referral management centre and then, putting a label referral management centre isn't going to work. Doing some of these things, that works. So this is where you get to the subtleties. The whole thing about, so the aha moment for me when I was in the department was sort of thinking about who decides. And there's this very complex thing we're heading towards. It's not, this is for the new world of the NHS in England. It's no different nowadays, really. In that you've got an individual and family who receives care from the clinician, who's a member of the practice, who will be a member of the GP consortia when GP commissioning comes away, when our new Secretary of State has her way. But you see there's this link all the way around here between the individual and their family, the care they get, as what they get as electorate, they vote for Parliament, government, Treasury. And there's a fundamental disconnect here between when people vote and what they do. So this decision, whether you do something or don't do something, is never driven by that voting process. That's where governments are generated from, by the electorate, who create parliaments, who then create the government. And that's the problem. And the problem is also that these things have to be either yes or no. That's why I wouldn't allow you to say somewhat. You can either implement GP commissioning or you can't implement GP commissioning. Although you can implement referral management centres in a certain way. So that's when the subtleties come in. But you can either do them or not do them. So bearing in mind what I was just saying about the four planets, when they come together, you can't work it out, and the sort of extreme complexity and the complex set of things we're dealing with. This is where I sort of realised actually this is where complexity theory might help us. So we have this sort of quandary at the moment. Kieran Walsh, a professor up at Manchester Business School, has written extensively about how terrible the present reorganisation in the NHS is, and yet it's in the full knowledge that we have no evidence that the present system actually works. Does it work? Does it not? I think somewhat. It answers everything. But there is evidence that that describes the strengths and weaknesses. So actually, is it worth fine-tuning or changing it? Yes, probably. Is it worth the tumultuous changes? I don't know. I honestly don't know. I tend to be more in favour of the current policy, but you probably guessed that from my previous research. So one of the problems we have is that we think of the NHS, and this could be true of any health system, but this is the NHS in England just for the moment, as a machine. We think about bits in isolation, we think about stroke care, we think about referral management systems, we think about exercise and referral. We think about these little things, but you can't think about them in isolation. There are many other factors that play. We often specify the changes in detail. So the exercise referral scheme is a brilliant example of where a minister wanted a policy. It was very attractive, let's get fat people exercising, that's really good, the Daily Mail's going to like it, it's going to be terrific, let's do it. And the policy was driven through, and yet, so that's often a problem. We often spend our time battling resistance to change, when actually resistance to change is more often about traditionalism. People have got a better idea. So those people who didn't do the referrals to exercise referral schemes, hey, those Richard Lehman, another Oxfordshire GP, who spent a lot of time shouting about going down to 7% HbA1c in the Quality and Outcomes Framework, he was quite right. His resistance to change was actually jolly good. His resistance to change about saving lives, thank you very much. And this constant idea of reducing variation as well. So we think about the NHS as a complex adaptive system. It's about a series of agents that work together, that interact, and it's not always predictable, and whatever they do, it sort of co-evolves. So GP surgery are linked with other GP surgeries who are linked with the PCT as it presently is, or consortia as it will be as, they're linked with the hospital, they're linked with, so on and so forth. And all those linkages and relationships are very complex. Their contracts have a factor, but it's not a consistent factor, so on and so forth. And that's a complex system. And the way you can recognise complex systems is that the agents in the system adapt. So whenever a policy comes in, my goodness, the NHS will adapt to it, sometimes in a positive way, sometimes in a slightly more negative way, as with the 4-hour wait, where there were all sorts of strange behaviours. Systems are embedded within systems, so that we've already talked about this idea of government and then policy and so forth, right down to organisation and individual level. There's always tensions and paradoxes. We've heard about our new Secretary of State here. If she implements GP commissioning, she'll get one positive thing, but the tension and paradoxes, she'll cause other problems elsewhere. You often get an amplification. Suddenly, that little loop of effects I've talked about, suddenly can make something happen really extraordinary happen that you just didn't believe. And then often shadow systems. So this little picture here is a reminder that when you go to a meeting and people talk about things, actually that's not the interesting stuff. It's what they talk about at the water cooler that's the really interesting stuff. And so these shadow systems often exist. Let's just crack on quickly. This is just one way to think about it, and I'll finish with this slide. We published this paper in the BMJ way back in the beginning of 2001, and the idea is when you're thinking about putting policies in place, you can start to think about the degree of certainty you have about the evidence and the degree of agreement about what you're about to do. Okay, so some policies come with high certainty, high evidence, and those will be considered simple. Some have low, nobody can agree, and the degree of certainty is very low. That's what we might call chaos, but a lot sits in this zone. GP commissioning absolutely sits in this zone. Referral management still sits in this zone. It's bordering on there. Cancer drugs bordering on there. And the different things you do, frankly, When you've got things in the complex zone, you just can't regulate, whereas in the simple zone you do. So some of the things you should just do. So for instance, putting in a venous thromboembolism program, there's such good evidence around that, we should just frankly do it because people are dying for not doing it. Whereas some of the other bits, GP commissioning or not, referral management system, you've got to try. So the real message I want to sort of give here is when you're a Secretary of State, there is evidence out there. We've heard a lot about that from Dan. There is other forms of evidence. You can use that, but because you're doing things within a complex environment where you're not quite certain of the outcome, and because of the environment in regard to the media and the political environment, you've got to use your judgment. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, both of you. You've given plenty of time to ask questions, so I'll invite any questions from you.
Yeah. Go on.
The gentleman at the front here, if you could just say who you are, Taz has got a mic and should.
I'm Vladimir Hachinsky from Canada. My question is a very general one, and that is, I think we have heard that all healthcare systems are unsustainable, and we have to improve quality. But one factor we haven't talked about is personal choice. In other words, the governments may pay for certain drugs because they're cost effective, but there may be things that are less cost effective, that have a high price, that individuals may be willing to pay for. What do you see the role of personal choice in sustaining the healthcare systems?
That's for you, I think.
Yeah, okay. I think it is.
Yeah.
Do you know, I think that comes back to the ideology that any country or political party has. So for some, the notion of people being able to buy better, or what you might call more marginal cost-effective healthcare, is antithetical just to the nature of the country or their political ideology. So you know, my personal feeling around that, well, that if the NHS or another health system is providing all that is effective, and someone wants to purchase something that is only partially effective, that that bone cancer drug, then that's fine. So long as we're not, from my own opinion, so long as we're not denying people who cannot afford it effective treatment, then I'm more comfortable. The problem I have is the way, if we just use that example of the bone cancer treatment, is often the way that it's often, shall I say, sold to patients. So Sophia Christie, who's a PCT chief exec in the Midlands, she talks about this not in terms of does it work or not, or so on. She talks about this actually. This is more like a human rights abuse. So people often come back from the apologies to fellow oncologists here, but she talks about people coming back from oncology clinics being told that the PCT has denied this life-saving drug. The truth is actually this drug might give them 3 or 4 months extra life. And they then go away and they try and raise the money, and they have a Just Giving page and so on and so forth, or they mortgage their house and they pay for this drug. They get 2 or 3 months of extra life at the cost of misery while they're taking the drug. So actually, I think this is not answering your question. I think there is actually a question before this: are some of the low-value treatments, should anybody be allowed them even? Even if they had the money, should they be allowed to buy them? Or under what context should they be allowed to buy them? And the answer is under the context of fully informed consent. And I don't think most people get fully informed consent for that type of drug.
No, I'll just say that I think there's a research angle there too, just about our risk communication in the consultation. And there's a lot of work going on and needs to be done still on making sure that consent is fully informed, and how, as clinicians at the front line, we are best able to fully elucidate risk and benefit. And often the decisions patients make are, absolutely bang on.
There's a lady in the green, just about 4th row.
Hello, my name's Penelope Jarrett. I'm a GP in London, and you're the first gentleman, your presentation, wherever you said researchers were frustrated, I'm sure you could put clinicians in there equally well. We've had all sorts of policy initiatives foisted on us with no evidence, or with the sort of spurious evidence. I was particularly frustrated reading the Healthcare for London proposals when they had the story about going down the tube line and your life expectancy decreasing as you go east, which is entirely true. And then somehow this elided into we had to have GP-led health centres, and there was no... the implication was that this was going to solve this problem of variation in life expectancy, but they didn't actually state that. And of course there was no evidence. And it's very, very difficult to argue with these sort of nebulous suggestions, and it was somehow, those of us who did argue against it, were somehow seen as not really caring about our patients. And I don't know how we try and encourage the policymakers to be evidence-based.
I guess this is part around the dialogue, isn't it, between policymakers and researchers. Could you come on the mic for a second? Can I just ask you, you said when you came back to them, what did you say? How are you constructing your bit of the dialogue in terms of saying, we don't need this?
Well, I mean, I personally did a feedback, because they asked for consultation. I don't know whether they ever listened to any of this, and I said that I couldn't see how I didn't know of any evidence, and they didn't present any evidence. Rather, to the contrary, some of the stuff they had in the appendix didn't match up with the rhetoric in the main body of the thing. And and I talked to people locally in my borough, PCT and so forth, but I think we were just ignored.
Either that or, it may not be that you ignored it, I never wanted to Tim, but it's about the whole value evidence thing, and I think it's the point that actually the health inequalities, certainly for the last government, was such a major plank that in the sense they were prepared to go possibly into areas where there wasn't a secure evidence base, and maybe with the hope that they would come along. I don't know if you want to add that, Tim.
I think that's a very good example where people leapt to the solution for the problem, where there might have been multiple solutions. So the evidence around the impact of good general practice on health inequalities is fabulous. So Barbara Starfield and others, just fantastic. So good quality general practice helps reduce health inequalities. And the second thing that is pretty much incontrovertible is the patchiness of access to general practice in more deprived areas. It has always been harder to get. There are lots of examples. There are lots of exceptions to what I'm about to say, which almost make it more frustrating, frankly. But the evidence base around access to primary care or general practice specifically is that in more deprived areas it is harder. So the problem I think that they were trying to describe is, look, there's huge health inequality. This is going to be helped by greater access or availability of good general practice. What can we do? A sensible approach, and what one might do in the new world of GP commissioning would be the GP commissioners sit down and say, inequalities helped by general practice, we haven't got enough good general practice, what can we do about it? And thinking through a range of solutions. What they leapt to is this solution called polyclinic and so forth. So I think you're right, there was this leap of here's the solution and it'll work. Well, the answer is, I hope we can all agree, better access to general practice in deprived areas, good thing, good evidence. But I think there's lots of ways of solving that particular problem, which is not just polyclinics. In some places, polyclinics might have been the right thing. I suspect a lot of places, there are loads of other solutions around.
Okay, I think we've got room for one more question. So, somebody at the back, fight it out between the two of you.
Oh, we can take...
Three of you.
Take two. No.
I made that lunch.
Yes, Saeed Farouk, consultant psychiatrist. I was just wondering, what is the state of evidence about involving the policymakers in designing the studies which produce the evidence?
That's a good point. Study design. I mean, Canada has. I know Canadians here, but I think there's links between policy and research in Canada that I've read about that seem quite functional. In this country, certainly the Service Delivery Organisation research branch, the NIHR, is a bit of that formal link. But in terms of what extent they design studies, it tends not to be that well sort of formally set out. Typically, there'll be a commissioning call from the SDOs to say, we want to know about this. And then it's up to the researchers to come back with a design that they think will help answer that question. I think there's no quite formal link, unless Tim, you're aware of.
Well, there are links. I mean, so just for instance, at the moment, they're looking for. I mean, this is actually quite encouraging. Actually, they're looking for a range of so-called Pathfinder sites for GP commissioning, and they deliberately said we want a whole range of different sites doing different things in different ways. There are a few sort of criteria, but actually we're happy to have different models because we're not quite sure of the right model. And one of the things they're doing in parallel with that is setting up a centre for commissioning research around this to look at those different sites and work it out. So there is a sort of very formal linkage that's going on there. So you do occasionally see it on particular policies, and actually the good news is on this particular policy they seem to have actually sort of thought about it and listened to some of the criticisms going on. Whether this will play out, I mean, the danger is if none of those sites succeed, will they then, what will they do? Will they behave in the same way they did around exercise referral programs and so on? Well, only time will tell. But at this point, I'm quite encouraged by that asking for diversity and actually in parallel setting up a research centre which will absolutely work alongside all those Pathfinder sites.
Okay, thank you all very much. For those of you who weren't able to ask your question, Dan and Tim are around during the lunch break, so hopefully you can get a chance to ask it then. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to the speakers for raising more questions than they answered, which I think is the addition of a great speech. And I hope that over the water cooler that you can come up with some answers. Thank you all very much.